Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final online lecture for UPFA, Understanding Business for Analysts. So I hope you're all really well in this final week 10 of term. Today, what we're going to do is to focus on a quick review of the module and then spend most of the time on your individual assessment, as I guess now that you have finished all of the quizzes and reflections, this is really where your focus is, and we have no more workshops for you to participate in this week either. So we're going to talk mostly about the individual assessment today and hopefully get at least your thinking started on that. So let's start with a review, or rather a reminder of the module content. So we've been through 9 weeks with you, looking at a whole range of topics and ideas. We started off by introducing you not only to the module, but also to the notion of an analytics capability and analytics maturity of an organisation in week 1. In week 2, we thought about who are the different groups of people or organisations that might be relevant to any analytics work you could be undertaking. So we looked at stakeholders. In week 3, we looked at structuring of problems using a number of qualitative approaches. And then in week 4, we differentiated between how you get to understand a business problem from a client's perspective, and then how you frame that problem from an analytics consultant's perspective. Moving on into week 5, we talked about ethical issues and some ESG concerns, and that's where we introduced the ideas of using AI in your assessment. So that may be one in particular you want to go back and look at. We then looked at planning the analytics projects, and if you remember there, we differentiated between waterfall and agile approaches and had great fun in the workshop getting you to experiment with those. Then in week 7, we looked at identifying and analysing and mitigating against the risks associated with an analytics project. 2 audiences for analytics work were introduced in week 8, the technical audience and the non-technical audience, and how you need to think about the language that you use and what you show to these 2 different audiences. And then last week, we went back to the topic of analytics maturity and looked at how you can grow the analytics function, focusing on each of the Delta Plus, which is the framework that we use, looking at each of the Delta Plus attributes. And so here we are today, doing the module review and assessment guidance. So I hope you have found the journey that you've had with us on UPFA a useful one. At times it's been fun, at times it may have been very new and very different to some of you. For some of you who perhaps have worked before, it may have enabled you to reflect on your practice in the light of the ideas and the concepts that we've presented. So let's move on to the individual assessment, and I'll go through both components of the assessment, so the participation and the individual assessment, and talk you through particularly the individual assessment. So I've taken some of these slides from the week 1 introduction, so they shouldn't come as a surprise to you given where we are now. So the module is assessed by 2 parts. The first is a participation element, which counts for 10% of your module mark. And there you had to complete 2 tasks every week, excuse me, in weeks 2 to 9. And those 2 tasks consisted of a weekly quiz after the lecture and then a weekly reflection, which we invited you to do after each of the workshops. So that's done and dusted. You can't change that now. The marks are set. And I will be checking later on this week the marks for the week 9, because that closed, the reflection task and the quiz closed yesterday lunchtime. So moving on then to the individual assessment, that counts for 90% of your module mark, okay? And the focus of that is reviewing the analytics capability and maturity of an organisation of your choice. And there you can just see a little outline of what is involved in that assessment. Okay, I think the key thing I just want to flag, I'm going to go through it in a lot more detail, don't worry, but the key thing that I want to flag is it should draw, when you see there, the third sub-bullet point should draw on the materials from weeks 2 to 8. So I think the next slide just goes through in an awful lot more detail. So here I'm going to jump to the very last point, which is that some of you are going to look forward to achieving 100% in your participation mark, because I know the vast majority of you, I think, have been really diligent in completing that work. I know some of you have struggled and stumbled, shall we say, along the way, but I hope that each of you will get a reasonable mark for that work. If there has been any reason why you've been unable to participate in the quizzes and the weekly reflections, then I would encourage you to speak to the programme team, particularly if you may have mitigating circumstances. So, now, preparing for the individual assessment. Okay, before I talk you through, what is it that you really need to do? You need to go through each week of the module. I've gone over it very, very quickly with you in that earlier slide, but you need to go through each week of the module and make a list of the concepts and techniques that are covered. Go back to your weekly reflections, because if you remember, I kept saying the weekly reflections are there for your benefit, not my benefit. And the idea of the weekly reflections is that you will have made some notes about the things that you would want to remember if you chose those week's themes to use in your assessment. The other thing I think that it would be helpful for you to do at this stage is to think about yourself. Where do your strengths and weaknesses lie in terms of the weekly themes that we covered? Were there any particular themes that really ignited your interest and that you really put a lot of effort into and you would consider that to be a strength? Were there any themes where you really struggled to either understand the concepts, apply the methods, and therefore you would consider that to be a weakness? So I think before you even start really to engage in the detail of the assessment for yourself, I think doing that preparation will be really beneficial for you. So now let's have a look at that assessment brief for the individual assignment, okay? Your first task is to choose an organisation that actively uses analytics. And if you look at the detail of the brief, we advise that you should not choose an organisation whose Delta Plus score would be 1 or 5, okay? So in other words, complete novices or absolute experts. So your organisation's analytics maturity needs to be assessed somewhere between 2 and 4, those 2 and 4 stages. So you've chosen your organisation. First thing that you need to do is to tell me, the reader, who your organisation is. Give me a brief introduction to your organisation. Now, you can see in brackets for each of these points here, we have a suggested word count, okay? That is not an absolute word count. I'm not going to count the words in your introduction and see whether or not they're between 100 and 200 words. It's just a suggestion to show you how the spread of your word count for the assessment could work across the different tasks that you have. So give me an introduction to your organisation, okay? Some of your organisation will be household names, well known. Some of them may be organisations I've never heard of. So give me a brief introduction. Then you need to use the Delta Plus framework to evaluate the analytics maturity of your chosen organization. So what am I expecting to see there? Well, I'm expecting you to see that you've used the Delta Plus framework and that you evaluate each of the elements of the Delta Plus framework and score each of them. So what score are you going to give data? Why are you going to give data that score? There needs to be a commentary, and we need both of those elements. We need the commentary and the score for each element. Then once you have evaluated each of the 7 elements of the Delta Plus framework, what is your overall score for the current analytics maturity of the organization? It is important that you give the overall score, because that helps the reader to appreciate how advanced their maturity is in analytics within the organization. The other thing that you can do at this stage is you can say, which of the areas of the Delta Plus framework would you prioritize for development? And we did some work last week on that with the algebra example in each of the workshops. Now, the third thing you need to do then is to choose a new analytics project, which your organization could use, as it says here, as a test case for moving the organization up the Delta Plus framework. In other words, to improve the analytics capability of your organization. So, a good assessment here would make a link between the introduction of the new analytics project and that previous section of where the analytics maturity of the organization currently is. In other words, they use the current Delta Plus profile and score to justify the choice of the new analytics project. Now, this project has to be a new project. It can't be one that already exists, already in production. Okay, but you can use historical information about their previous work in analytics in order for you to position that new project. So let's just pause and just go over it again. You've introduced your company, you've evaluated the organizational maturity of their analytics capability, and you have suggested a new potential project that the organization or company could undertake in order to improve that capability. The next block is then to say, let us analyze our project using 2 themes, okay? 2 themes taught on the module from weeks 2 to 8. In other words, we don't expect to see the Delta Plus framework appearing as one of those weeks, because that was taught in week 1 and in week 9. So weeks 2 to 8 is what you can choose. Okay, and what are those weeks? Just a quick reminder. Here we go. So we're going from week 2, understanding stakeholders, through to week 8, communicating to different audiences. And your task here is, for using each of these themes, analyze your project. Okay, analyze your project and just checking my notes. What are you doing these analyses for? You're doing these analyses to essentially show ultimately how your project is going to be successful, the things that you need to bear in mind in order to make it successful. If it's successful, then it should lead to an improved analytics capability. So the question becomes, what themes should you choose? And what you can see on this slide, I don't know if you'll be able to read all of the detail from where you are, depends on what device you're on. But what I've done is I've taken the list of concepts and methods that we covered in each of the workshops and the lectures. Hopefully I've done a comprehensive list here, not missed anything out, but you can see in the final column on the right-hand side there, all of the different types of approaches that we took you through. So the question becomes, which 2 themes should you pick? And earlier on, I talked about thinking about your strengths and weaknesses. The other consideration that you need to think through is how joined up, how connected is the overall narrative of your assignment. Which means that you need to think about whether your themes could potentially be linked so that they feed into one another. They don't have to be. You could choose two completely independent themes, but if you do choose two themes that have a natural linkage, then that does need to come through your analysis of each of the themes. So, for example, if you chose ethics week 5 and risk week 7, then one of the outcomes of your ethical analysis, for example, if you've developed the business ethics canvas, then that will help you identify opportunities and risks associated with your analytics project. So you could feed that into your analysis, into a broader analysis of the risks that may be relevant to your project. So that would be an example of how the two themes would link. You might want to link, for example, weeks 3 and 4, making sense of problems with understanding business problems and analytics approaches. So in the making sense of problems, you might want to use some of those questions to help you structure the problems that you think are relevant to your analytics project, the business problems that are relevant to your analytics project, or the business problems that your analytics project addresses. And then in the week 4 theme, you're talking about how you relate that understanding of the business problems with the choice of analytics approaches that are going to be used in your analytics project. So again, there's another link. And I'm sure you could link others. For example, another obvious one would be stakeholders and communicating to different audiences, because you could show through your identification of different stakeholder groups, you could divide them into technical audiences and non-technical audiences and talk about how you would communicate to those two different audiences. So I hope that gives a few examples of how you can pair up the themes that you are going to use for your analysis. Once you have done your analysis of themes, you get to the end of your individual assignment where you need to bring it all together and answer the so what question. So how do you structure that final section? Well, first of all, you remind us of the Delta Plus evaluation and the score that you gave. You remind us of how your choice of project addresses that Delta Plus score and is intended to improve the analytics capability of the organisation. You summarise the analyses of the two themes and any recommendations that came out of those analyses. And that pulls together then the final set of recommendations. What needs to happen in order for the analytics project you've chosen to be successful? How does that then improve the analytics capability of the organisation? So a final ending point, you could go back to the Delta Plus score and talk about which of the elements would be improved by your analytics project. And that would be a nice ending to your individual assignment. So I hope that run through gives you a narrative to hang your thinking from in terms of how you approach that individual assignment. So just a few words. I may have already said this again. Yeah. A few words about choosing a suitable organisation for your assignment. So I didn't mention this first point, is what type of organisation. It can be any. It can be a private company or it can be a public sector organisation. Right, so we have a question from Amber. Where do you suggest we do the research findings on the company that we choose to analyse? Well, I'd probably throw that one back to you, or maybe open it to the wider group rather than putting you on the spot, Amber, and say, what do you think? Where do you think you're going to find information about your company? What do the rest of you think? Yep. Obvious places, company website, assuming that there is one. So, Sebastian says, if you've picked an organisation that you've previously worked for, you could go back and talk to the people there. I wouldn't suggest that you cold call an organisation that you haven't got any contacts in and ask them to complete a survey or anything like that. One, you just really haven't got time to sort of design yourself a survey. And even with interviews, you need to think carefully about the amount of time you're going to need to design your interview questions. And I wouldn't be suggesting that you go and talk to 50 people in an organisation or anything like that. I think the key message that's coming across, and which is one that I would support, is you need to use a variety of sources. So starting with the company website, or if you've previously worked there, you could perhaps go back and talk to one or two colleagues that you worked with. But there'll be other secondary sources that you can use, such as news articles, the annual report. The library has various databases and sources. So definitely do look at the library. They sometimes have details about specific companies. And just check that name. Nut makes a good point. Maybe you need to think carefully about what company you should choose, a company that does have information publicly available. Very good point there. Well, and the last comment coming in, if we talk with people in a company, would there be any confidentiality issues? Quite possibly. That's why I think I would say I would not contact a company cold. In other words, if you don't have a personal contact in a company, do not contact them. We don't want companies to be inundated with MSBA students and really not understanding what it's all about. So you're going to talk to somebody, if you've worked somewhere previously, that you know well in that company. If you want to talk about an organisation and you think there may well be confidentiality issues, can you anonymise the name of the company? That's a possibility. There are ways that you can cite that you've talked to people. You can include transcripts of interviews in an appendix, Amanda. So that is credible if you've got that in there. But to be honest, if I think back over the years where we've had versions of this assessment before, very few students talk to people in companies. Very, very few. Most of them are reliant on secondary sources for their information. So another one, if I choose the company I worked for and I know some insights, but it's not publicly available due to confidentiality, would you assess that the info I put in my assignment is legitimate? I think if it's the sole source, then, how do we know? And if you don't show any evidence of where that information's come from, how do we know that you just haven't had AI generate it for you? So I think the key is the variety of sources is what I would be looking for. The variety of sources. The other thing that you've got to remember, I think I brought this up at one of the workshops last week. The other thing that you've got to remember is that Delta Plus evaluation is not worth a lot of marks. Most of the marks for the assessment are going to come from the project and the themed analyses. So don't stress too much about it. If we go back, let me just check what I'd said about the words. 1,000 words for assessing the analytics maturity of the organisation. That was the suggested work limit. It is not the majority of your assessment. So don't stress too much about it. Because even if you don't have an awful lot of evidence to support what you do, but you do a reasonable assessment of their analytics maturity and it sounds plausible, you're going to get some marks. You might not get super duper marks, but you are going to get some marks. The bulk of your marks are going to come from your introduction to your project and its analysis and how you link your analysis of the project into the Delta Plus scoring, okay? And that's your work, that's not anyone else's work. So don't stress too much about, where am I going to get all this Delta Plus evidence from, because it is not the majority of marks for the assessment. I think what we're more interested in is that you make plausible, coherent arguments for it. You show that you've attempted to do some research to support it, but it's the way that you present the analysis and how joined up it is in the context of the bigger picture of the assessment. That's really what's more important than have you used, millions of sources for your Delta Plus score, because it's not the majority of the assessment. So let's move on to look at quality. I'll just take one more question before we go from Key Fan. If I anonymize the company as it is a company that I work for, how should I show the references and show you that's not an imaginary company? Yeah, I think that's a good point. Maybe you can't really afford to do that. I'm on the spot really with that one. Do you know what? I think that would really be a helpful question if you would post that in the module forum page. I've set up a forum for assessment queries. Post it there. I will go consult with my colleagues and I'll post a response to that question. I think rather than me standing here sort of thinking, and giving you a reply, let's do it that way. Because anonymizing the company is what an awful lot of people do. But you're quite right. If you've got references that says, my company's Sainsbury's, or, referring to Sainsbury's, this, that, and the other, then it's pretty obvious who your company is. So leave that one with me. So let's look at marking. What have we got on this slide here? So let's go to the left-hand side first, because this is the good news. The good news is this is the profile of marks from last year. The average mark, and I believe these are module marks rather than assessment marks. Okay, the average mark for the module was 64%. That is a merit. Maximum was 77%, and the minimum was 7%. I suspect that minimum came from somebody that got a participation mark but didn't do the individual assessment for whatever reason. Okay, so I've taken these figures off my WBS. Now, before I go on to the other bits on this slide, I've had some questions. I'm just going to ask Josh if he could scroll back so I could check. Was there any more? No, can you go to the bottom again? Oh no, so there wasn't. Sorry, I thought some other questions had come in. Right, so let's move to the right-hand side of this slide. You will see that down the criteria column, these are the marking criteria that we have to use to mark your work, okay? So we mark them, and you can see they're equally weighted. Comprehension. I'm just going to jump to the next slide because that explains what each of these are, and then I'll go back. So comprehension is about how well do you understand the concepts and the methods that we taught you. So you've got to show knowledge and understanding of what we've taught you. Analysis. This is where we mark the analysis that you've done. Is it joined up? Have you used the techniques correctly? If you have done a power interest grid, have you drawn it correctly? If you've done a probability impact matrix, is it drawn correctly? If you use work breakdown structure from the project planning week, have you drawn that out correctly? Okay. Critical evaluation, right? Showing capacity for original thought by questioning relevant arguments and identifying strengths and weaknesses. This is where you are going to be doing your justification and where you're going to be critiquing what you've done, where you're going to be coming up with your recommendations, okay? And where you're going to perhaps be referring to the audit trail of analyses that you've done to justify the recommendations you've come up with. One of the places where students often fall down is they make recommendations at the end of the report and you think, oh, they're nice. Where did they come from? Out of thin air? Because there's no thread going back through the report showing where they've come from. And then the last one, how is the work presented? Is it clearly written? Is it clearly structured? Has it got any references? Are the references correctly cited, etc.? So let's now go back and let's look at the range. So what you can see is each of these we will be grading essentially on this scale, where excellent is clearly the distinction level, good is the merit level, pass is a pass, and poor is a fail. So clearly you are all aiming for a profile of excellence, a profile of distinctions. Okay, and if that is the case, then it gives you an explanation there of what we'll be looking for. Other points just to draw out under the comprehension. We're basically looking to see that you've taken this module. You might think, why has she said that? You'd be surprised. Students that have not engaged well in the module will bring in all sorts of tools and techniques that we have not taught them. Okay? Now, while it might be relevant to use another analysis that we haven't taught you, you've got to remember that the whole point of the assessment is to assess you given what we have taught you. So we would expect to see the vast majority, if not all of the methods you use, being ones that we've taught you. So we have a question from Nut. Is the mean 64 out of 100 or 64 out of 90? I think this is the module mark, which is 64 out of 100, because otherwise the 7% doesn't make sense. We have never given 7% for an individual assessment. Not that I remember anyway. That's why I think this is the module mark and not the assignment mark. Now, the other thing I guess that you can see here is that there are some very qualitative statements. What do you mean by reasonable? What do you mean by comprehensive or limited appropriate evidence? Okay, this is where our academic judgment comes in. Okay, so we will be using our academic judgment to evaluate what you've done. We know what we've taught you. We know what we haven't taught you. We know for what we've taught you, how much detail we've taught you. So, you know, we bring that academic judgment to bear when we place you on that continuum of poor to excellent for each of those criteria. And for your individual assignment, you will each get personalised feedback that highlights, you know, where you've done things well and where things perhaps haven't gone as well as they could have done, and therefore what might need improving. So I'll just pause there before I move on again, see if there are any questions. Okay, we'll move on. So let's get you to see how well you've understood what that's all about. So just have a quick read of each of these pieces of feedback. Okay. So in the chat, tell me, which box do you think is a piece of feedback about comprehension? Which box is a piece of feedback about comprehension? Now, got a difference of opinion at the moment? Remember, comprehension is about Showing knowledge and understanding of the subject matter. So yes, you're quite right, D. Interesting that somebody thought it might be C. We'll come back to that one later on. But I do get why you would think it could be C. Because that is implying that you do have knowledge about that. So let's just reveal the score that might fall into for the comprehension. Okay, that's a distinction level piece of work that comment relates to. So which comment do you think relates to the analysis marking criteria? Super, no brainer. A, it's got the word logical analyses in it. Okay. And that would be a merit level mark. Or if you like, a comment that we would put in when the work was of merit level quality. So what about evaluation? Critical evaluation. Which box relates to critical evaluation? Yeah, I think you get the pattern. Okay. Now, this comment would be the sort of comment that we would write for something, a piece of work that was of a pass level quality. And you can see there, that bottom sentence does not include an audit trail linking recommendations back to analyses. This was a comment that got written on many of the assessments last year because the students hadn't presented a coherent narrative, a joined up narrative threading through their assessment to show where things had come from. So they'd done a reasonable piece of work, they'd done some good analysis, but actually they didn't do too well in terms of pulling it all together, if you like. So I'm not going to ask you about the last one because it's a bit of a no-brainer, yeah? The last one is about writing. But what mark do you think it would have got? The B box is about academic writing. Do you think it's a fail, a pass, a merit, or a distinction? Yeah. Yeah. This is a very low mark. Yeah, remember, because you are postgraduates, a pass mark for you guys is 50%. So to get a really low mark in writing means it's really hard to read. A lot of some of the classic mistakes that students make under this category is the citations. They don't cite correctly, or their references aren't correctly detailed, or there are fake references because they've used AI inappropriately. And we spot them. Why do we spot them? Because we know our subject. We know the literature associated with our subject. Therefore, if you pick a particular theme, we would know the sorts of references that should appear under that particular theme. And we randomly check them. And that's often where the fake references surface. And you need to be careful, because if we suspect that the work is not entirely your own, then there is action that we can take. We can refer you to the academic conduct panel who will investigate further. And you don't want to be in that camp. We had a student last year who received 0% for their assessment and had to resit it. But I won't go into details. Right, so let's pull it all together. What might your contents page look like? Remember, you're writing a report, so you should have a contents page. You don't need an abstract or an executive summary. You don't need any of that, but you do need a contents page, okay? So this is the structure that you could use. Feel free to use your own, but here is a suggested structure for your contents page. And the little circles in blue just give you things to remember. In the top bubble, I think the key thing I'd like you to take away from this is that after you've done each analysis, I would expect to see a summary of the key findings or recommendations, and then that would link to the later recommendations and conclusions. You know, if you've summarized the outcomes of your analysis and the so what of each of the analyses, then when I see your recommendations later on, I am not surprised because I know where they've come from. And that then links with the second bubble, which is about the audit trail. An audit trail is this notion of a thread that runs through so that enables me to follow the analysis as it goes step by step, because I can see how this bit here relates to the previous bit. And then when I move forward, I maybe am carrying some things forward too. So it's this notion of a thread running through. So, use of AI. So AI is permitted, okay, for this assessment. On your front cover sheet, you need to say what you've used AI for. Be honest. Please be honest about where you've used it. Most of what I guess we'll evaluate is what we think comes from you. So if you're using AI in any way to do some research, it's a source. But the critical evaluation and the writing and the evidence of comprehension should come from you. So you have to say where you've used it. And don't worry about how much detail you put in, because it doesn't count towards your word limit. So the last bit that I really want to focus on is what we mean by critical thinking, okay? Because one of the things that, oh, hang on a minute, there's a question from Carla, I think. I can't see. Oh, Kata. How long should the declaration be? 10 pages is too long. Most declarations are about half a page. If you want to be completely transparent and include some of the prompts that you've used, if you've used AI or something like that, you can always put them in an appendix. But again, I wouldn't be expecting to see, I'd be worried if I saw 10 pages of AI prompts, because I'd be thinking, what research have you done yourself? You'll see if you on the cover sheet for the assessment, there is a box for your declaration. So you may need to investigate. And if you're not sure, pop that question in the forum and I'll ask the program team. I'm just making a note. And what was the other one? Anonymized org. There we go. I don't know if it's an auto-generated. So if I don't know if Raishi, you're a student, aren't you? Whether you know where these cover sheets come from, whether you could type something in the chat there. If not, post it in the forum. One of the things that we're noting over, I'd say, the past 2 years, and one of our concerns about AI, is this abdication of critical thinking. AI-generated assessments are very boring to read. Overuse of Grammarly, because somehow you think that we want to see professional writing, are dull. I would much rather see some minor grammar errors, but hear your true voice rather than what you think is professional writing. Because sometimes professional writing is very vague, bland, uninteresting, or sometimes particularly if your English is not your native language, you allow it to use words inappropriately because you don't understand the subtlety of their meaning. I would much rather see your own words. So we're going to spend a little bit of time, last 10 minutes or so, talking about critical thinking, okay? Just a few little exercises for you, a little bit like before. So, what is critical thinking? It is a habit of mind. And as you go through your analytics careers, it's a habit of mind I would encourage you to develop. What are its characteristics? Comprehensive exploration of issues, ideas, artifacts, events before accepting or formulating an opinion or conclusion. In other words, you gather your evidence from your various sources that may include AI. You let it stew in your brain, and then you make your mind up. What do you think? You form your opinion, your conclusion. You make the connections. Please do not abdicate your critical thinking to AI, because you won't get a good mark. So the next couple of slides talk about critical thinking dispositions. Okay? And this shouldn't really come as a surprise to you. What does it mean when you're writing? It means you have to be critical of the sources you use, even if it's AI. I think there will be a minority of you, at least I hope it's a minority of you, that will be quite anxious about this assessment, because it may be that you come through very quantitative degrees before and you haven't had to write a lot of essays. And because of that, and perhaps because you don't allow yourself enough time to do the assessment, you may rely on AI. Please don't, because there's a good chance you won't pass. So plan your time. Think about the planning week we did. Think about the end point. How much time? The end point, I think, is the 23rd of January. How much time before that have you got to when you need to start your assessment? Because I know you've got other exams too. And for some of you, those other exams may be causing you more anxiety than the other assessment. Optimization models in particular, I know, causes some of you some anxieties. So be critical. Think about why you should or should not accept something. Can you think of any problems with a writer's argument? If the answer is no, you can't, fine, leave it for now. If you can't find a reason why you should not accept something, don't stress. You don't have to, okay? But if you are in that critical mindset, then you will be thinking about these things. Does the source make sense? Is it plausible? How does it relate to what I'm doing? Can I think of anything else? Are there any criticisms of methods that you've used? Can you think of ways that things could be improved? And here's just another source that talks about them. I think point 3, try to be well informed, which means do your research. Do your research not just about the company, but about the themes. You know, we expect to see academic sources to support your analyses of the themes. If you're going to be doing stakeholder analysis, go and look at the week's workshop or lecture and see whether Eleanor gave you any references. Look at the reading list for that week. Are there any references to follow up? So your reference list shouldn't only be about the company to support the delta analysis. Let me just see, anything else? I think some of these I've already covered. I think point 10 is one to take into account. This resonates with the notion of what does validation mean? Validation of a model is sufficiently accurate for the purpose at hand. Okay? So I would encourage you here to think about how much precision does the situation require? And I would apply that to the delta analysis and to your theme analysis. How much precision does the situation require? Sufficient precision. And then you need to work out what you think precision means. So, how do I pull this all together? Okay, formulate your question. You have your question, we've given it to you. Gather your information. That is information about your organisation, but it's also information that you're going to use to analyse your project with the two themes. Use that information, apply it, do your analysis, and do some critical reflection about the implications. What are the recommendations? When you're doing your analysis, you might want to talk about limitations or any assumptions that you've made. You might want to show evidence of different points of view. So, what we're going to do now is just to give you some examples. Okay, I'm going to show you in each of these slides phrases that illustrate the purpose. So here, what I want you to do is just read that paragraph and think, where does it talk about critical comparison? You don't need to type anything in the chat. I just want you to think about it. I'll come back to your question, Nut, in a bit. Remind me if I don't. So, mindful of time. There we go. I'll show you. So, critical comparison. Okay. However, there has been a turn in the academic discussion away from the identification of individual communities and one position within them. Now, actually, that language is quite formal, so don't stress about that. Basically, it means that in the literature, there's been a change of position over time, and that people are now talking about something that they weren't talking about before. Okay, so that's critical comparison. What about critical evaluation? Have a little read of this. And just think about, where are you being critical? Where are you making a critical evaluation? Now, I would posit that there are two elements to critical evaluation. The first is noting the evidence, and the second is commenting on it. So if you look at the first two red lines, the report does not specify any difference between reading formats. There was no mention of using electronic devices. That is noting the evidence, or lack of it. The second part is the explanation or the commentary, if you like. This is because the original project was conducted in 1980 and we weren't using ebooks then. However, I imagine that the results of a similar project, if it were done today, would produce similar data. So you can see that in the first two red lines, we're sort of noting what the evidence was, or where there wasn't the evidence. And then in the second point, we are providing a commentary, an explanation, or a view about that evidence. So last one, critical reasoning. Have a read of this and think, where in this paragraph is the signposting that critical reasoning is taking place? I'm just going to read, that's it, I just want to read it. need to suggest focus areas actually. I don't really know what he means by that, but right. Mutter. Okay. So, what do we see going on here? The first sentence is summarising what's going on. The first and second categories above suggest that to be successful in life, we need to mark out specific time and space for studies, blah, blah, blah. Okay. However, finding a formula for the best balance is difficult. So we are showing evidence here of critical reasoning. We're sort of taking that statement of above, that summary of above, and then we are proposing something. We're reflecting on it. You know, finding a formula for good work-life balance is difficult. Okay, so that's an example of critical reasoning. So I hope those three examples of style of writing there show you the sorts of things that we're looking for under that critical evaluation section, beyond making the recommendations and providing an audit trail. It shows that you're critically engaging with the approaches that you've chosen to use for your analysis. Where do you bring that in? Well, where it's relevant, where you want to talk about it. It's not that it all has to be grouped together and put in one place at the very end or anything like that. Now, I'm just going to read, I've got a question from Nut. Looking back at our algebra case, do we need to suggest focus areas actions in the delta plus analysis, or just reviewing their analytics capability? I'm not fully sure that I understand the question. So in algebra, you've done the analysis of the delta plus. You've scored each of the delta plus areas. You've got an overall score of the delta plus of algebra. I think we put it in between 2 and 3, didn't we? Most of the categories were 2 and a couple were 3. So it's going to be at stage 2. In the workshop, we also gave you the priorities of each of the priority list, showing you, I think data was ranked as the top priority. But in the workshops, we got you to think of potential projects that would address each of the delta plus areas, and some of them went across delta plus areas. So I think the key is that whatever your new analytics project is, it's got to relate to the delta plus evaluation. Because if you've come up with a delta plus evaluation of 2.5, where leadership is the weakest thing, and your project is all about building data lakes and warehouses, you think, well, why have they chosen that project given the profile of delta plus that's previously gone before? Now, there may well be a really good reason why that's a really sensible project, but if there's no rationale linking the project with the delta plus evaluation, then we don't know why you didn't go for the lowest scoring thing, for example. You don't have to go for the lowest scoring thing, as we said in each of the workshops, but there has to be a rationale as to how you've chosen your new analytics project. So another question. The part where we set priority and suggest actions we might do to improve them in the first workshop. We did it last week, in the workshops last week. We went forward because the week 1 workshop was all about how do you evaluate the capability now and suggest priority areas. What we did in the week 9 workshop was, what do you do with that? So you really need to go back and look at the week 9 workshop and lecture. The lecture in particular, where Michael and I were playing tag team, we talked through each of the delta plus elements and talked about things that you could do to improve each of those elements. So I hope that answers your questions there. So I'm just going to quickly finish off with one last slide about potential problems. I don't understand something in the assignment brief. Well, first of all, go back and read it again, maybe talk to your mates, but be careful about talking to your mates because sometimes they give you a poor steer, shall we say, because they haven't understood things correctly themselves. If you are really unsure, post something in the UBFA forum on my WBS. Please don't send Eleanor, Michael and I emails on Christmas Day expecting us to reply because we won't. The university is closed for a period over Christmas and we won't be necessarily checking our emails during that time. We probably won't be checking the forums either. So be mindful about when you post things. If you bombard us with loads and loads of emails, we might come back to you and say, please post it in the forum, particularly if it's a question that is generically relevant to everyone. A lot of the questions you've posted today have been excellent questions that other people will want to know the answers to. You've never done this sort of thing before, okay? So go back over the session that we've done today, but also have a look at the writing resources on my WBS. If you're not confident in your English grammar and spelling, you can install Grammarly. Yeah. It's free. Declare it as AI. And you're not sure what's expected. Again, reread the brief. And if you're still really not sure what's expected, having listened to the week 10 lecture where I go through the assessment in quite a lot of detail, then ask for clarification. But please, if you haven't, well, I suppose if you haven't been in the lecture today, then you're not going to know this, are you? Please don't just ask for clarification when you haven't bothered to read the assessment or watch the videos. So I think we're running out of time. So we'll just finish with these next steps. What should I do now? Okay, and I would encourage you to do it now. You've no workshop this week. You've plenty of time. Set up your assignment using the formatting guidance we've given you today. Okay, make a list of the most relevant contents and techniques and methods for weeks 2 to 8. Okay, and then have a look under the learning resources, academic writing section of my WBS, particularly if you're new to essay writing. Now, somebody asked me if I had office hours this week, and I wanted to find a time when you were all free. So I have your timetable here, and I can see that Wednesday 2 to 3 is when everybody is free. So I'm proposing to run an office hour. I'm going to check with the program team whether I can go into this WBS Live setting and sit online for an hour in case any of you have any assessment queries. So run over a little bit, but I hope you don't mind. Thank you very much for attending today. Thank you very much for your participation in the module. We've really enjoyed it this year. We've loved all of your engagement. We've loved all of your little characters and personalities. We haven't quite loved the fact that you all talk over each other, etc. But as you can see, we always try to deal with that in a jovial way, shall we say. So I hope I get to see you again at some point during your MSc. I wish you well in your forthcoming exams and assessments, and I hope you have a lovely Christmas. Please do not be alone over Christmas. Make sure that you are either with friends or family. Check out the university if you're staying around because they do have loads of activities for students that are here. Bye-bye, everyone.